Long before Erich von dem Bach orchestrated the mass murder of civilians across Eastern Europe, he was simply Erich Julius Eberhard Zelewski, a boy born on the margins of the German Empire. His story did not begin with privilege or power, but rather with economic hardship, a fractured identity, and a hunger for belonging, elements that would one day shape a man willing to commit unspeakable crimes in the name of ideology. Erich was born on the 1st of March in the year 1899 in the town of Lauenburg, now Lemborg in modern-day Poland. His family's roots were not traditionally German but Kashubian, a Slavic ethnic minority from northern Poland. At home, the family spoke Polish and Kashubian, languages that placed them at odds with the rising tide of German nationalism that would soon engulf their world. Though the Zelewskis were Catholic, Erich would later convert to Protestantism, possibly as an attempt to align more closely with German nationalist ideals. Poverty defined his childhood. After the death of his father, who had already lost the family's estate and become a travelling salesman, the young Erich was scattered into foster care along with his siblings. Growing up in East Prussia without a stable home or parental guidance, he likely internalized a deep sense of instability and resentment, emotions that would later manifest in brutal ways. At the age of 15, when most boys were still in school, Erich volunteered to fight in the First World War. He was one of the youngest soldiers in the Prussian army, and by the war's end, he had been wounded twice, once by a bullet and once in a gas attack. He was awarded both classes of the Iron Cross and promoted to the rank of lieutenant, the equivalent of a second lieutenant. The trenches had turned the adolescent into a hardened soldier, and for a man like Erich, war had become not only a duty but a calling. After the war, he remained in the military, participating in campaigns against Polish forces during the Silesian uprisings. These early conflicts between Poles and Germans over disputed territories may have further fueled his racial and nationalistic views. In 1921, he married Ruth Apfeld, and together they had 6 children. On the surface, his life may have seemed stable, but beneath it, Erich was a man in search of identity, status, and power. The turning point came in the early 1930s. Erich joined the Nazi Party in July of 1930 and the SS, the Schutzstaffel, in February of the following year. He quickly began climbing the ranks, propelled by loyalty to Hitler and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to prove himself. But there was one problem: his Polish-sounding surname, Zelewski. In a regime obsessed with racial purity and Aryan lineage, his name became a liability. To distance himself from his Slavic heritage and elevate his standing, Erich adopted von dem Bach, a name that sounded aristocratic and distinctly German. By 1940, he had officially dropped Zelewski from his name altogether. In the process, he was not merely changing his name, he was reconstructing his entire identity, erasing his past to better serve the violent future he envisioned. But the irony was inescapable. Here was a man of Slavic descent, with sisters who had married Jewish men, now rising through the ranks of a regime dedicated to the extermination of both Slavs and Jews. This contradiction would be buried beneath layers of uniform, title, and authority. For Erich von dem Bach, loyalty to the ideology of the Nazi state mattered more than truth, heritage, or morality. His participation in the infamous Night of the Long Knives in July of 1934 solidified his place within Hitler's inner circle. That night, hundreds of political opponents were purged, and Erich used the chaos to eliminate his personal rival, Anton von Hoberg und Buchwald. This act of political murder was rewarded with a promotion to SS Gruppenführer, Major General, proving that in the Nazi hierarchy, ambition and brutality went hand in hand. By the time the German army stormed into Poland in the autumn of 1939, Erich von dem Bach had already secured his position as one of the most trusted enforcers of Heinrich Himmler's vision for the East. Now operating as a higher SS and police leader, he stood at the forefront of executing the Nazi state's racial engineering and territorial reordering of Central and Eastern Europe. For von dem Bach, the invasion of Poland was not simply a military conquest. It was the opening act in a long-planned ideological war. a war that sought to erase entire populations and replace them with what the Nazi regime believed was the racially superior German stock. Following the swift defeat of the Polish army, Nazi leadership quickly moved to reshape the region. The newly conquered territory was viewed not as a battlefield to be pacified, but as a blank canvas upon which Adolf Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, living space, could be painted. Himmler, as Reich Commissioner for the Strengthening of German Nationhood, believed it was Germany's destiny to colonize the East. The Polish people, seen as ethnically inferior, were to be displaced, enslaved, or eliminated to make room for ethnic Germans. Von dem Bach, as Himmler's deputy in East Silesia, became an essential figure in implementing these designs. Von dem Bach's tasks in occupied Poland were not administrative formalities. He directed operations that uprooted entire communities. One of his earliest responsibilities was overseeing the forced expulsion of tens of thousands of Poles from their homes. These expulsions were carried out with mechanical cruelty. Polish families were given only minutes to gather belongings before being marched away, their homes handed over to German settlers brought in from across Europe. Records show that under von dem Bach's leadership, more than 18,000 Poles were forcibly removed in just one coordinated campaign. These were not isolated instances of wartime excess. They were the planned execution of a demographic vision rooted in racial ideology. In the wake of these expulsions, von dem Bach's role deepened. With Polish prisons overflowing due to mass arrests, Nazi officials began to consider more radical solutions. It was during this period that von dem Bach was directly involved in identifying a site for a new type of detention facility. He personally recommended a former Polish army barracks near the town of Oświęcim as an ideal location. That place would soon bear a new name, known across history as Auschwitz. Though von dem Bach was not the camp's commandant, his connection to its founding places him among the architects of what would become one of the most infamous symbols of the Holocaust. Auschwitz began as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners, but soon evolved into a site of industrialized extermination. The role that von dem Bach played in setting its foundation underscores the transition from occupation to annihilation. He was no longer just a regional enforcer, he had become a logistical conduit for genocide. Even as he helped design the machinery of oppression, von dem Bach continued to rise within the ranks of the Nazi power structure. His administrative and ideological alignment with Himmler allowed him greater authority in Eastern territories. By this time, the war had begun to engulf Europe. France had fallen, the United Kingdom stood alone against the Reich, and in the East, Hitler's eyes turned toward the Soviet Union. Preparations for Operation Barbarossa, the code name for the invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun. Hitler viewed the Soviet Union not only as a military threat, but also as a stronghold of ideological enemies, communists, Slavs, and Jews. When German forces finally launched their assault in June of 1941, it was the largest land invasion in history. Accompanying the Wehrmacht were mobile SS units known as the Einsatzgruppen. Their purpose was not to fight soldiers but to murder civilians, specifically Jews, political commissars, and so-called undesirable elements. Von dem Bach was appointed higher SS and police leader for Central Russia, a vast region that included Belarus and the western territories of the Soviet Union. In this position, he wielded immense authority. He coordinated with Einsatzgruppe B, one of the 4 primary mobile death squads tasked with mass killings behind the front lines. These were not rogue units operating in secrecy. They reported body counts directly to Central Command, and von dem Bach was among those reading, endorsing, and often contributing to these reports. The massacres escalated quickly. In cities like Minsk and Riga, Jews were rounded up in ghettos under brutal conditions. Starvation, disease, and random executions were daily realities. Soon after, mass shootings began in nearby forests and ravines. Entire communities were annihilated within days. By August of the same year, von dem Bach's coordinated units had murdered over 30,000 individuals in Belarus alone. He received promotions for his effectiveness, including a new title as General of Police and SS Obergruppenführer, equivalent to Lieutenant General. But von dem Bach's involvement was not limited to giving orders. He was actively engaged in planning and inspecting operations. He maintained close relationships with field commanders and encouraged harsh reprisals against civilians in response to partisan activity. This rationale, punishing entire villages for the actions of a few, became central to the Nazi campaign in the East. It was through such reasoning that genocide became bureaucratically justified. In Belarus, the consequences were catastrophic. Villages were razed, civilians shot en masse, and the Jewish population nearly wiped out. Aerial reconnaissance was used to track resistance movements, and then entire regions were cleansed by Nazi units operating under von dem Bach's oversight. These operations were described euphemistically in reports as anti-partisan warfare, but in practice they were campaigns of ethnic destruction. Civilians, often unarmed and uninvolved, were systematically murdered. To many within the Nazi hierarchy, von dem Bach was seen as indispensable. He had demonstrated a talent for both ideological commitment and logistical efficiency, but there were signs that the horrors he unleashed were taking a psychological toll. By early 1942, he was hospitalized in Berlin, reportedly for intestinal issues linked to opium abuse. Rumors circulated that he was suffering from hallucinations. Visions of Jews being shot haunted his sleep. Whether these reports were factual or attempts to fabricate a narrative of remorse is unclear, but they marked a pause in his direct involvement with the Einsatzgruppen. Following his recovery, von dem Bach shifted his focus. He requested reassignment to anti-partisan warfare, a domain that blurred the line between military necessity and genocidal intent. These operations, while framed as security measures, continued the same methods of mass killings, forced deportations, and destruction of communities. His new command, the Bandenkampfverbände, was tasked with rooting out resistance, but it became yet another instrument of terror. One of the key features of this phase of his career was the manipulation of statistics. Von dem Bach's units frequently exaggerated the number of enemy combatants killed, conflating civilians with partisans to inflate success metrics. These false reports helped justify further atrocities and painted him as a commander capable of delivering results. Military gains were minimal, but the human cost was staggering. Entire villages were wiped from the map, not because they posed a threat, but because they existed in contested zones. By mid-1943, the Eastern Front was beginning to turn against the Germans. The Red Army was regrouping, and partisan resistance was growing stronger and more coordinated. Still, von dem Bach continued to lead operations in Belarus and Western Russia, leaving behind a trail of devastation. Burned-out towns, mass graves, and shattered families were the legacy of his command. As the Nazi regime began to falter under the weight of military defeats and rising resistance movements, one city emerged as both a beacon of defiance and a graveyard of hope: Warsaw. For Erich von dem Bach, already infamous for his ruthless campaigns across Belarus and Soviet territories, the Polish capital would offer another opportunity to prove his loyalty to the collapsing Reich. What unfolded in the summer of 1944 was one of the most brutal episodes of urban warfare in modern history. It was also one of the most glaring examples of state-sanctioned civilian mass murder. And at its centre stood von dem Bach, no longer hidden in forests or distant provinces, but now orchestrating death in full view of the world. The Warsaw Uprising began on the first day of August in the year 1944. Unlike the earlier ghetto uprising of 1943, this resistance was led not by a doomed Jewish minority, but by the Home Army, the underground military wing of the Polish government in exile. Their goal was to liberate Warsaw before the advancing Soviet Red Army could occupy it, in hopes of securing political sovereignty and avoiding a Soviet-controlled future. The German response was immediate and unrelenting. Hitler viewed the Polish resistance with contempt and rage, ordering the city to be annihilated and its population exterminated. To carry out this scorched earth policy, the Nazi high command turned to a man they believed could handle the brutality required: Erich von dem Bach. He was appointed commander of all German forces in Warsaw with explicit orders to crush the rebellion at any cost. Under von dem Bach's authority, a coalition of regular Wehrmacht troops, SS formations, police battalions, and paramilitary units were brought into the city. Among them was one of the most feared and reviled groups in the Nazi military apparatus, the Dirlewanger Brigade. This unit, named after its leader, Oskar Dirlewanger, was made up of convicted criminals, many of them repeat offenders of violent and sexual crimes. Dirlewanger himself had previously been imprisoned for raping a teenage girl and had a long history of predatory abuse. This brigade did not merely fight wars, it committed atrocities as a matter of routine. Von dem Bach was well aware of the Dirlewanger Brigade's reputation. He had full knowledge of its past actions in the Soviet Union, where it had participated in mass executions, the burning of villages, and widespread rape. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, he allowed the brigade to lead the assault on Warsaw. His decision was not tactical, but ideological. He knew that terror would demoralize the resistance and obliterate civilian willpower. The most infamous event under von dem Bach's Warsaw command was the Wola massacre. During the first week of the uprising in the Wola district of the city, his forces executed a systematic campaign of mass murder. Over the course of several days, more than 65,000 civilians, men, women, children, and the elderly, were slaughtered in cold blood. Victims were dragged from homes, lined up along walls, and machine-gunned without mercy. Hospitals were set ablaze with patients still inside. Women were raped, then murdered. Infants were thrown from balconies or shot in their beds. The massacre was not an act of undisciplined troops losing control. It was a calculated, coordinated effort ordered from above and executed with precision. Von dem Bach, though not physically present at every atrocity, held full command responsibility. He received reports of body counts, issued further orders, and made no attempt to intervene or halt the slaughter. If anything, the brutality of the massacre was a reflection of his methods, a continuation of the same extermination policies he had employed in the East, now transported into the heart of Europe. Beyond Wola, other districts of Warsaw experienced similar horrors. In Ochota, SS units rounded up civilians and held them in makeshift detention camps where beatings, rape, and murder were constant. In Mokotów and Czerniaków, street executions became daily spectacles. When Polish resistance fighters surrendered or were captured, they were often executed on the spot or tortured for information. Von dem Bach's forces implemented a zero-tolerance policy, disregarding the Geneva Conventions and every principle of international humanitarian law. Despite this campaign of terror, the Polish resistance did not collapse overnight. The uprising continued for over 2 months, fueled by determination, underground resources, and civilian solidarity. Throughout this period, von dem Bach received increasing pressure from both Hitler and Himmler to accelerate the destruction. He responded by intensifying bombardments, ordering the use of flamethrowers, and levelling entire neighbourhoods with artillery and aerial strikes. One of the most surreal moments of this period came in late September of 1944, when von dem Bach, perhaps sensing the futility of the campaign or seeking to reshape his image, opened negotiations with the remaining Polish resistance leaders. The talks culminated in the surrender of Tadeusz Komorowski, commander of the Home Army, on the 4th day of October. Von dem Bach accepted the surrender with ceremonial decorum, presenting himself not as a war criminal but as a military leader conducting honourable warfare. This staged civility was a thin mask for what had already occurred. By the time the uprising was fully suppressed, approximately 200,000 civilians had been killed. Over 70% of Warsaw had been reduced to rubble. Historical buildings, libraries, and archives were intentionally destroyed. The city, once called the Paris of the East, was now an open wound, a symbol of calculated cultural and human annihilation. In an extraordinary gesture of Nazi recognition, von dem Bach was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross on the 30th day of September. The award was meant to honour bravery and leadership in combat. That it was given to a man who had overseen the massacre of an entire city's population reveals the extent to which the Nazi regime had divorced itself from moral reality. For von dem Bach, it was another step in his career of cruelty. During the Warsaw campaign, rumours began to circulate that von dem Bach had personally taken possession of cultural artefacts, including the preserved heart of the famous Polish composer Fryderyk Chopin. Though accounts vary, it is believed that the heart was removed from a church and kept in von dem Bach's private collection before later being returned. If true, it speaks to the grotesque contradictions within the man, a commander who could order mass executions while preserving symbols of the culture he was destroying. After the fall of Warsaw, von dem Bach's reputation within the SS was both celebrated and scrutinized. On one hand, he had delivered on Hitler's demands. On the other, whispers of psychological instability and dependence on narcotics resurfaced. Still, he remained in high regard within Nazi circles, and in the final months of the war he was dispatched to Hungary, where he assisted in installing the fascist Arrow Cross regime and contributed to the persecution of Hungarian Jews. But the destruction of Warsaw marked the climax of von dem Bach's career. It was his most visible and violent campaign, one that placed his name in the annals of 20th-century war crimes. Unlike the distant executions in Belarus or the cold logistics of resettlement in Poland, Warsaw was personal, immediate, and recorded. Witnesses survived. Photographs were taken. The ruins stood as testimony. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed and the Allies closed in from all sides, many high-ranking Nazi officials chose death over surrender. But Erich von dem Bach, seasoned by decades of political maneuvering and survivalism, did not intend to die. Instead, he intended to adapt. Having overseen some of the most horrific crimes of the Second World War, from mass shootings in the East to the destruction of Warsaw, von dem Bach was not just a soldier of the regime, he was its executor. And yet, as the dust settled over a defeated Germany, he managed what countless others could not. He eluded justice. On the 1st of August in the year 1945, von dem Bach was arrested by American military police while attempting to flee. Unlike other SS commanders who were quickly identified, tried, and either executed or imprisoned, von dem Bach had a different fate in mind. He saw an opportunity in the chaos of post-war justice. The Allies were desperate for information, especially regarding the Nazi hierarchy, the Einsatzgruppen, and internal power struggles. Von dem Bach offered all of it. The heart of his strategy rested on cooperation. He was one of the first senior SS leaders to testify publicly about the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. At the Nuremberg trials, he became a star witness for the prosecution. He confirmed that mass killings of Jews and political prisoners were not rogue operations, but policy decisions approved by top Nazi leadership. He openly stated that the Einsatzgruppen were organized death squads and that there had been collaboration between the German army and SS units in carrying out extermination operations. But von dem Bach went even further. He claimed to have resisted Himmler's more extreme ambitions, including an alleged plan to exterminate 30 million Slavs. This supposed moral opposition was never supported by evidence, and many historians consider it a fabrication designed to distance himself from the worst crimes of the regime. Yet the narrative found traction. The Allies, particularly American intelligence officers, saw value in von dem Bach's knowledge of internal Nazi dynamics. His testimony helped build cases against others, and in doing so, he managed to reposition himself from perpetrator to participant observer. This calculated rebranding bore fruit. Despite overwhelming evidence of his direct involvement in atrocities across Eastern Europe, von dem Bach was not charged with crimes against humanity at Nuremberg. Neither Poland nor the Soviet Union succeeded in securing his extradition. He avoided the fate of many of his peers, including Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who was executed, and Odilo Globoknik, who died in custody. Erich von dem Bach, one of the architects of Nazi terror, walked free. In the years immediately following his release from Allied custody in 1949, von dem Bach largely disappeared from public view. He settled in West Germany and attempted to lead a quiet life, yet his past continued to cast a long shadow. In 1951, he was sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp, not for crimes against Jews or Slavs, but for political murders carried out during the early 1930s in Nazi Germany. Even then, he was not imprisoned until a full decade later, highlighting the uneven and often contradictory process of post-war justice in Germany. During the intervening years, von dem Bach did not remain idle. In 1951, he made a sensational claim that he had personally provided Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring with the cyanide capsule that allowed him to commit suicide in his prison cell just before his scheduled execution. Von dem Bach even produced cyanide vials with serial numbers close to the one used by Göring. Although the story was never confirmed by authorities, it became part of the strange mythology surrounding his post-war life, a tale that simultaneously cast him as conspirator, accomplice, and opportunist. While these claims kept his name alive in the media, they did not result in further legal consequences. German courts continued to handle his case with a degree of hesitation that reflected the broader post-war struggle to reckon with Nazi crimes. Many former Nazis had re-entered positions of influence in West Germany's new political and legal systems. The Cold War had also shifted Western priorities, placing greater emphasis on stability and anti-communism than on rooting out every last war criminal. In 1961, von dem Bach's luck began to change. He was finally imprisoned for the earlier murder of Anton von Hoberg and Buchwald during the Night of the Long Knives, a crime he had admitted to in post-war testimony. That same year, he was also convicted of perjury related to his previous legal defences. The combined sentences, however, were short compared to the scale of his wartime actions. That year, he also re-entered public life in another surprising way. Von dem Bach testified at the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Eichmann, captured in Argentina by Israeli agents and brought to trial for organizing the logistics of the Holocaust, was the most prominent Nazi to face justice since Nuremberg. Von dem Bach's testimony was seen as a potential opportunity to establish the command structure and independence of the Einsatzgruppen. In his statements, von dem Bach claimed that Eichmann had no authority over the mobile killing units and had merely been responsible for deportation logistics. This assertion served two purposes. First, it reinforced von dem Bach's image as a military commander who operated in a separate chain of command from the bureaucrats of the final solution. Second, it subtly attempted to downplay the unity and coherence of the Nazi extermination machine, suggesting a system with blurred responsibilities and chaotic implementation. In reality, historians have demonstrated that the SS operated with tight coordination and von dem Bach's Einsatzgruppen worked in tandem with the same logistical networks Eichmann helped design. Nonetheless, his appearance at the Eichmann trial placed him once again at the center of global attention. Unlike Eichmann, however, von dem Bach returned to his cell in Germany, where he continued serving time, not for genocide, but for killings committed within Germany before the war had even begun. The juxtaposition was staggering. Here was a man who had overseen the deaths of hundreds of thousands, yet was legally accountable for only a handful of political murders. In 1962, the German courts sentenced von dem Bach to life imprisonment for the murders of German communists in the early 1930s. Yet, like his earlier convictions, this sentence sidestepped the events that made him infamous. He was never prosecuted for his role in the Holocaust, never stood trial for the liquidation of ghettos, the razing of villages, or the civilian massacres in Warsaw and Belarus. His crimes against humanity remained officially unacknowledged in courtrooms, even as historical records made them undeniably clear. It is important to understand that von dem Bach's escape from justice was not an isolated anomaly, but a reflection of the broader failures in the post-war legal process. The sheer scale of Nazi crimes made full accountability difficult. Political expediency, limited resources, and the shifting priorities of the Cold War all contributed to incomplete justice. While the Nuremberg trials did establish a legal precedent for prosecuting crimes against humanity, many perpetrators slipped through the cracks, von dem Bach among them. His ability to survive the war, reframe his role, and benefit from political conditions speaks to a certain cunning that he had exhibited throughout his life. From changing his name to obscure his Slavic roots, to eliminating rivals under the guise of loyalty, to turning informant to avoid prosecution, Erich von dem Bach had always been a man who adapted. His post-war life was simply the final act in a long performance of opportunism and self-preservation. The story of Erich von dem Bach did not end with his death in a hospital bed in Munich. His legacy, unlike that of other notorious figures of the Nazi era, did not provoke widespread outrage, international remembrance, or enduring cultural reckoning. Instead, it slowly dissolved into the bureaucratic silence of a post-war Germany that was eager to move forward. The absence of justice in his case, the failure to fully prosecute him for his crimes, and the general reluctance to confront his role in mass murder illuminate deeper questions about how societies remember, and often forget, the perpetrators of history's darkest chapters. Following the war, Germany entered a period of division, both geographically and psychologically. The Federal Republic of Germany in the West and the German Democratic Republic in the East developed entirely different narratives about the Nazi past. In West Germany, political and economic reconstruction took precedence, and the new government, deeply intertwined with former Nazis at various levels, was often hesitant to fully confront the scale of collaboration and complicity. In East Germany, the communist regime framed Nazism primarily as a capitalist evil, blaming West Germany for its continuation while downplaying the responsibility of the German people at large. Within this fragmented landscape of remembrance, figures like Erich von dem Bach fell into historical obscurity. There were no monuments to his victims erected in his lifetime, no sustained international pressure for renewed trials, and no truth commissions to investigate the institutional systems that enabled his rise. In contrast to more widely recognized names like Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, or Adolf Eichmann, von dem Bach's name remained unfamiliar to the broader public, known primarily to historians, archivists, and the relatives of those whose lives he destroyed. One possible reason for this erasure lies in his lack of symbolic presence. He was not captured in dramatic fashion like Eichmann, nor did he take his own life in a bunker like Hitler. He did not preside over a camp like Rudolf Höss, whose name is forever linked to Auschwitz. Instead, von dem Bach occupied a middle space in the Nazi hierarchy, a powerful executor of policy, but not a widely recognized face of genocide. This allowed him to disappear more easily into the folds of post-war amnesia, but the consequences of forgetting him are not only moral, they are educational. When societies fail to remember perpetrators like von dem Bach, they risk misunderstanding how systems of atrocity truly operate. The popular image of evil is often distilled into singular, monstrous figures, yet the machinery of genocide depends not only on its architects, but on those who translate vision into action. Erich von dem Bach was precisely such a figure. He did not write the ideology, but he implemented it with ruthless efficiency. He made choices that turned theory into practice, paper into execution lists, and borders into killing fields. His ability to survive the post-war years without facing full legal consequences also reflects the limitations of international justice in the 20th century. The Nuremberg trials, while groundbreaking, could only try a limited number of defendants. Political priorities quickly shifted as the Cold War escalated, and soon former Nazis were being recruited into intelligence networks, military advisory roles, and even government positions in both Eastern and Western blocs. The memory of the Holocaust was sidelined by the politics of containment, deterrence, and the nuclear arms race. This context allowed men like von dem Bach to evade full exposure. In his case, he even managed to recast himself as a witness to evil rather than one of its enablers. His courtroom testimonies became part of the official record used to prosecute others, yet he remained largely unaccountable. It was a disturbing inversion of justice. The criminal became the historian, the murderer became the messenger. In the decades following his death, German society began to reckon more deeply with its past. The 1970s and 1980s saw a wave of second-generation Germans demanding answers from their parents and public institutions. Historians began to revisit the archives, uncovering names and roles that had long been buried. But even during this resurgence of memory, von dem Bach did not emerge as a primary figure of focus. His crimes, though vast, remained scattered across documents, footnotes, and confidential reports. One of the most glaring silences surrounds the massacres in Belarus, where von dem Bach's coordinated campaigns led to the deaths of more than 200,000 civilians. These atrocities received far less global attention than other war crimes in Western Europe. Belarus, devastated by war and then folded into the Soviet sphere, did not receive the international spotlight that Poland or France did in the post-war narrative. This imbalance in historical visibility contributed to von dem Bach's relative anonymity. The people he helped murder were, to the world's eyes, invisible. The obliteration of entire villages, the annihilation of Jewish communities, and the incineration of partisan strongholds across Eastern Europe were written off as unfortunate outcomes of war, rather than deliberate policies of ethnic extermination. Von dem Bach, positioned at the center of those policies, should have stood as a symbol of the consequences of unchecked power, ideological hatred, and bureaucratic obedience. Instead, he slipped through the cracks, protected by his own manipulations and the world's selective memory. Today, as societies around the globe continue to confront historical injustices, from colonial violence to racial persecution, the story of Erich von dem Bach remains a vital case study. It challenges the idea that justice is inevitable, that the worst offenders will always be held accountable, or that historical truth naturally triumphs over political convenience. His life forces uncomfortable questions. How many others like him were never punished? How many witnesses were allowed to become narrators? And how do we preserve the memory of victims when their killers are allowed to shape the narrative? In recent years, memorial projects in Belarus, Poland, and Germany have attempted to document the full extent of Nazi crimes in Eastern Europe. Digital archives, survivor testimonies, and academic studies have begun to piece together the scope of von dem Bach's operations. These efforts, however, come late. Most of the survivors are now gone, their stories preserved only through interviews and written accounts. The perpetrators, too, are dead. What remains is memory, fragile, contested, and essential. The case of Erich von dem Bach also offers a cautionary tale about the nature of justice in times of transition. Post-war Germany faced the monumental task of rebuilding a nation shattered by ideology. In the urgency of reconstruction, many compromises were made. Former Nazis were reintegrated into society under the assumption that their expertise was needed for stability. These decisions were pragmatic but morally fraught. They created a legacy of unfinished justice, a legacy that continues to shape how Germany and the world approach questions of historical responsibility. It is also important to recognize that von dem Bach's story is not merely a German story. It is a European story, a human story. It reflects how ordinary individuals, when given power without accountability, can become instruments of vast suffering. It shows how systems of bureaucracy, when fused with ideology, can produce atrocities at scale. And it warns that silence, whether from fear or fatigue, can be the final victory of those who should have been condemned. In examining the full arc of von dem Bach's life, from a poverty-stricken child in East Prussia to an SS general coordinating genocide, from a war criminal to a courtroom witness, from a celebrated commander to an obscure obituary, we confront the uncomfortable truth that history does not always punish its villains. Sometimes it lets them fade. Yet, even in fading, they leave shadows. They leave questions for future generations. And they leave us with the burden of memory, the responsibility to tell the stories they tried to bury, to speak the names of those they erased, and to ensure that justice, even if delayed, is never forgotten. The name Erich von dem Bach should not be a footnote. It should be a warning.